Hello and welcome. I'm Robert Ravensbergen, conversational AI evangelist here at Automat, and here to help us explore the wide world of e-commerce UX today is Ben Labay, research director at CXL, formerly known as ConversionXL, an international conversion optimization institute and agency based in Austin, Texas. CXL Institute is used to train teams from some of the world's largest beauty brands and retailers, including L'Oreal, Sephora, Glossier, Avon, Revlon, and more, with more than 50 online courses in everything from copywriting and A/B testing to applied neuromarketing and data-driven influencer marketing. Ben has published research on e-commerce user experience across a variety of verticals, including one study of brands in the beauty industry. We'll be talking today mostly about how beauty brands can use e-commerce, CRO, and UX to drive revenue. But first, a little bit more about Ben. After studying evolution and behavior at the University of Texas at Austin, Ben got his Master's of Science in Aquatic Resources and Biostatics before his research career took him in the direction of user behavior, user experience for e-commerce, and for conversion optimization. Ben is a statistics and customer experience expert that works daily to scope and conduct research programs for companies around the world. So Ben, so glad to have you here with us today. Anything you want to say to get started?
Hi, Robert. Yeah, nice to be here. I'm jazzed that you reached out, and I love to talk and geek out about these subjects. And so, yeah, excited to dig in.
Awesome. So just to get started and kind of set a little bit of context, from your research career and career in academia, how did you find your way to researching e-commerce UX?
Yeah, I was in academia for 9-10 years or so prior to sort of making a bit of a leap and starting working with, at that point, ConversionXL Institute, when it was just getting started about 4 years ago. So I started working with Pep Laya, the founder of CXL. And we were conducting a lot of these UX experiments. And so he needed someone with a bit of an academic experimentation, hypothesis testing background. So I kind of came in and started to direct some of these UX studies on things like price perception, eye tracking studies, to looking at how people would, how are they processing information, going from, web pages through, perception and then behavior on websites. So after conducting a lot of these, the Institute ended up sort of focusing more on the core of its product, which is just the courses. The research that we conducted in that first year, super valuable. It's all available on our blog. A lot of next level content there that we continue to sort of iterate on, and even to this day work with our agency side clients, and as the core of like certain lines of hypotheses and testing. There's some examples there related to e-commerce, related to pricing, again, price perceptions and luxury goods and things like that might apply. So yeah, the leap from academia to the marketing world started with this sort of hypothesis testing, these activities, and just sort of expanded from there. And I guess for the last few years, been working most directly on the agency side with clients.
Okay. And just as a top level thing for the audience, what are some of the kind of services that CXL, both the agency and the institute, most commonly offer to brands and retailers? Globally, basically.
Yeah. So the company as a whole, I would say, we're a boutique agency in the sense that we focus on, we're not a full marketing Swiss Army knife. We focus purely on that on-site experience and understanding user and customer perceptions and behaviors, and then trying to change those perceptions and behaviors, usually through the tool of A/B testing. So we're doing a lot of managed experimentation program development and management. The Institute, again, 4 years ago, we started that up just to have our own product as well. Most of our managed services are quite expensive, as most agencies are. Our blog has a huge list. The majority of these people would never be interested or potential leads for the agency. So let's set up our own product so we can sell kind of these courses and training to this other crowd. And so that's kind of what was the birth of that. And that jives with our brand in terms of trying to be a thought leader in the space, being very open and transparent about all of our methodologies and our research and process-based focus that we have as a brand.
Okay. So specific to kind of some of the beauty brands we wanted to talk about, you had this UX benchmark report. I think it covered 4 brands, which are Sephora, Lush, Fresh, and Clinique. Just as more or less a framing device, the same thing that's in the report, you guys establish 5 dimensions of UX benchmarking here, which are appearance, clarity, credibility, loyalty, and usability. So could you speak a little bit to, what each of those traits or characteristics means and how they most directly contribute to e-commerce UX?
Yeah, I'll have to start from the beginning on this one because most of the credit here goes to a man named Jeff Sorrow out of a company called Measuring You. He's out of Denver, I believe. But you can go to measuringyou.com, I believe it is, and kind of dig into a lot of this as well. And he's published a lot of peer-reviewed literature on this standardized survey that he calls the Super Q. And it covers 4 of these dimensions that you mentioned, all of them except for the clarity dimension. So we worked with him a few years ago where we had our first project was working with bicycles, actually. So sites like Specialized and Trek and things like that. And we used the Super Q, but we added this 5th dimension because when you think about usability, loyalty, and loyalty, the NPS benchmark is in that dimension. But usability, loyalty, credibility, appearance, these are dimensions that don't really speak directly to the idea of conversion rate optimization. So why should I buy from this website instead of its competitor? And so we worked with him and added a 5th dimension, this one about clarity. It's all about sales propositions, why this site and not another. But these 5 dimensions kind of, just the language that it sets forth is quite interesting because most people look at, UX as a singular thing, but there's components of it. So that just sets up a framework to have kind of more intelligent, in-depth conversation about where we should put our efforts in terms of improving the experience and the story that we provide customers or potential customers. And then the process in terms of getting data, having people go through the standardized survey is very analogous to a system usability score, but for an e-commerce experience, right? So it's, kind of like user testing at scale, asking a bunch of questions, and then sort of benchmarking one site either longitudinally, so you do it on day 1 and you do it maybe 6 months later, see where there might have been shifts in the environment, or you do it competitively, and that's the study that you referenced there. So seeing how Lush compares to Sephora, compares to Clinique, and within these dimensions, where we could see that one site might be behind the other in one of them to a pretty large degree. That helps focus a testing program, a branding program. It helps focus the site efforts in terms of how we should address certain things.
Okay, so along each of these dimensions, would you have an example of sort of a particular type of experience or piece of content, or just something a user might say that sort of relates to it, like for instance, for appearance versus clarity, or credibility versus loyalty?
Yeah, so generally we're getting somebody to perform a set of tasks on a website and then answer these Likert scale questions that are, again, in the loyalty dimension. You've got that NPS question: how likely are you to recommend to a friend? And then they're scoring it. Then later on, we might ask some sort of open-ended questions and get some color, but it's not surgical to those benchmarking metrics, because those are those Likert scale questions. So similar to an NPS, you might ask an open-ended question after that and get some nuance or some color about why somebody had the experience that they did, or why they might be a promoter versus not, right? But the direct tie in this case, because it's such a lengthy survey, is not as direct, it's not as surgical as that singular NPS question. Although that said, we do work with sites to cycle through some questions. If they've got an NPS mechanism,
Hmm.
why not ask a question? This website was easy to use, 1 through 10, and that question in particular is quite powerful and explains a lot of the variance and all of that question set altogether. Actually, so you can be real surgical. You don't have to ask them all at once. You can, if you're
Hmm.
interested in like how well trust is conveyed and credibility is conveyed, you can be quite surgical on that. Then ask that open-ended question and get some responses. So around trust and credibility, Lush, for example, I think that site has a particular brand and style that's just not prototypical, and they're going for a particular type of audience, and it's a bit jarring for a lot of people. And so there might have been some open-ended responses with regards to how product discovery was, how people might have been distracted from product discovery because of the boldness of that brand, the imagery and things like that on that
Okay.
site. So that's like, after I rambled there for a little bit, that's kind of I think I tried to answer your question there at the end.
No, well, I think the main thing is, how, there's two levels that you can use this methodology, right? One, which is just a general assessment and kind of understanding the overall performance and usability of a site. And then if you have bottlenecks, if you're aware of an issue, but not necessarily sure how to define it, like you said, you can piggyback in with those more specific or more targeted questions, especially if there's already an NPS survey or something like that, and
Hmm.
then use that to like really hone in on the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. You brought up bike retailers, and I'm thinking like maybe there's a bit of a double question here, because one thing I think our audience would want to understand, just for context or just for in terms of playing to the strengths of the industry, what are some elements that beauty brands might stand out or overperform in terms of these UX benchmarks compared to other industries? And what are other aspects or parts of the benchmark where they might underperform or might not necessarily have the same priorities?
Yeah, good one. So appearance is really important for the beauty and cosmetics industry, and the sites, they need to, they're very well branded. They're very slick, and I think that this needs to be important. The bar is quite high there. I would also say that message clarity is an important one, in the sense that we're talking about a commoditized product. There's a lot of brand stories that are associated and try to counter this commoditization, but ultimately there is commoditization in the beauty and cosmetics world. And so message clarity therefore is quite important. And how to solve that is a little bit different. Sephora is going to solve that a little bit differently than a brand like Lush, who's a little bit more targeted. But generally, the message clarity, how you differentiate and how consistent you are within that brand story, is important. And then the testing and kind of experimentation world, this is a type of testing that we do to address this, not just to get wins. It's not only about superiority testing, but when we're affecting brand and the brand story, it's about a lot of what we call non-inferiority testing. Let's try to shift perspective without hurting transactions, but then trying to tie that into downstream metrics to affect maybe AOV initially, but ultimately lifetime value, as well, which is that brand. That brand North Star.
Hmm. So these brands really have to tell a strong story, but at the same time, when it gets or as consumers approach a purchase decision, they really have to have some strong ways to differentiate products or from other competitors implicitly to actually like achieve the best possible conversion, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think it's you asked the question you asked in the beginning, what's kind of an area that this industry has a particular kind of a problem solving, right? And that's a particularly tough one. I think the usability one is something that we're getting better and better at as the internet improves, basically. So that's not one that stands out, but appearance is good. It's where they're kind of ahead of the curve, just generally because they have to be, and that's because they're fighting that commoditization. They try to appear. There's a lot of attempts to affect perceived value.
Hmm.
And that kind of comes out on that appearance and the site design side of things.
Okay. So specific to the study, so people can understand more of the process, essentially it was based on a large kind of volume of user testing, and subjects were asked to, one of the tasks was to find a lipstick for $25 or less, add related items, or discover and add related items, and then also find a gift for a friend. Can you speak to some of the most common obstacles or issues users faced when they were going through these e-commerce sites and trying to just solve for or achieve these sort of simple shopping tasks?
Yeah. So when we kind of drill in and start thinking about these tasks, I'll kind of mention the goals of them. Generally, those types of tasks that you mentioned speak to product discovery and product comparison. So these are the, why websites exist, especially in the retail world, is to find some things and to compare and help facilitate that decision. And so those tasks, the purpose of those tasks are for that, because they're very common amongst these websites, and so we want somebody to kind of go through that experience. And if they are going to trip, if there's tripwires to trip on, if there's areas that are frustrating, if they're not able to quickly find something, we want to get that signal out of there. And it's not, when you say user testing, I'll make a comment here as well, a bit of a distinction. When we're doing this, we need to do it at scale. Most of our studies are at least 100 people going through this exercise and contributing to the benchmark metric. But we're not doing it in that traditional user testing sense where we're showing the screen and they're talking out loud, things like that. We're setting them up with we have a panel. There's a survey mechanism using something like SurveyMonkey, something like that, and then they're going through these tasks, and when they're done with the task, there's either a question, maybe a URL validation step, something like that. But we're not recording and watching all of these videos at a time. But there's certain guardrails that make sure that that they go through there, and then they answer all the Likert scale questions within the benchmark survey, and then some open-ended questions as well, just to make sure they're human and get some perception data from them as well.
Mm-hmm. So on a certain level, it's, there is accountability to ensure that there's, a legitimate experiment being followed through on. But with the self-reporting, do you kind of see, because, in real life, people self-report and people have their experience and they have their own memory rather than having been tracked and understanding from the outside looking in that whether they had a good experience or not. So do you see a common theme in terms of the self-reporting where brands can generally improve, or generally the users might not be as satisfied as they could have been?
Actually, in the sense of the way that we've run this, generally you're gonna skew towards, they're gonna be a little bit more satisfied than they would otherwise be, because like price perception, for example, like we're getting a panel and paying these people to go through here, so they're not gonna be real price sensitive. And that signal is not going to come back at us as strong as it would in the normal population of customers for any given site. But at the same time, they're being asked to be critical, and so usually they are a bit critical, maybe a little bit more than they otherwise would be. So you have to balance that with this type of research and this type of data, and that's where a little bit of the art is in, taking in these responses and go the satisfying step of actually applying, finding insights from the data and then applying kind of changes to an experience because of that data. You got to kind of be a bit artful in terms of how you make those leaps. And, for example, not just listen to what people say, but try to read between the lines and understand how they feel and what they mean by these words that they're throwing out, or how they're rating these types of things. Another example of this is that these benchmarks, NPS is a good example, they are accurate but not precise. So what I mean by that is the sort of the bullseye moves individually and across individuals. Depending on how much of a category connoisseur you are, like I might be really familiar with Lush.com, but not as familiar with Clinique, and then not as familiar with the industry as a whole. And the more that I find out about the industry, the more of a connoisseur I am about this category. My scoring might change in terms of what, think about that clarity metric, that clarity benchmark. How clear do I know that this brand tells me why I should buy from them as opposed to another brand? The more of a category connoisseur you are, the better you will able, your metric will shift.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's accurate for you always, but it's not precise in the sense from person to person. It can get a bit wonky, and this applies to NPS and a lot of these benchmarking metrics generally. So
yeah, so there are some sort of experimental biases that brands
yeah.
need to be really mindful of in order to get the most out of this kind of program or survey.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that goes for the standard stuff like NPS as well, which we'll tie it back to that people know a little bit more.
Yeah, well, definitely there's always some issues about reliability there.
Yeah, it has, for good or for worse, it's used.
Yeah. So to your point a bit, I mean, the primary goal of, or to what you mentioned in an earlier question, kind of we see the primary goal of any e-commerce site, especially for retailers, is helping consumers find, kind of discover, evaluate, and buy products. Are there any other goals that brands are mindful of, and how does achieving those kind of differ? I think in particular, you mentioned Lush had a very distinctive appearance and brand identity, and that might have gotten in the way of some goals, but also might have been to the end of some others.
Yeah, I think there's two sides here. There's like that brand side, and then there's sort of that e-commerce transactional website side of things, and that's where I'll focus. I mean, real quick on the brand side, there's certain goals there with regards to perception. The NPS, for example, that's the metric to understand how our brand affects loyalty and things like that. But swinging back over to that transactional web area and your question about product discoverability, that's usually a huge focus in terms of any kind of experimentation program, navigation, search, especially on mobile. That's a huge focus. That's a big goal. And in the end, we're trying to get to impress people, provide impressions on them related to the brand and the differentiation as they go through that navigation or search funnel. But in the end, we want them to buy, right? That's, as you mentioned, the primary goal. The other goals with an experimentation program, as you go down funnel, are going to be the big ones for a retailer is going to be average order value. A lot of sites that are really clean, really straightforward UX. I think as competition removes differentiation and we all sort of, all these sites are on Shopify all of a sudden. There's not much differentiation. We're going towards prototypicality, so that usability thing is not a problem. And people are used to buying. People have pretty good motivation to buy. Conversion rates are pretty good, or even too high in some instances. Then where do you focus that experimentation program? It's going to be on AOV. Amazon, you and I talked about this before offline. Amazon gets 30% roughly of their revenue from cross sells, upsells. This is a statistic that's out there. I'd like to see some updates on it, but this is what brands are focusing more and more on with their experimentation programs. And then after that, it's going to be LTV, especially if you've got subscription products. That's a key down funnel metric to keep an eye on. Sometimes you want to maximize for conversion rate, but sometimes you will actually depress conversion rate to maximize for LTV.
Okay. So obviously having those broader goals in mind, even within the study, kind of the consumers that were surveyed seemed to really express a strong preference for very elegant sites and product presentation. And obviously as things approach kind of a prototypical experience, that'll aggregate towards something that is fairly high quality. Is there, other aspects where brands get in their own way with ways that they try to increase conversion on top of their baseline experience? It could be stuff like pop-ups or certain aspects of personalization, for instance, that don't necessarily actually improve the overall outcomes they get.
Yeah, I mean, the customer engagement tactics out there, you mentioned pop-ups. There's a lot of different things related to that, and loyalty programs, referral programs. I don't necessarily have a poor opinion about some of these tactics. I think that there's poor execution in a lot of times, but the there's good intentions behind them, and it's all about how they're implemented and where and what what trigger points that they come into play, and does it make sense. For example, we talked just a second ago about the upsell cross sell. We see a lot of success in the sequence of events that happen between product page and checkout. How direct that is, how much of a bit of a story is told related to that transaction in terms of what is some additional value that could be had if you think about this extra component that might be related to what you're about to purchase that you might consider. And so that story arc is where a lot of focus is, to engage, to maybe have a pop-up or something like that, but it's addressing AOV, and it's addressing adding value related to what somebody is interacting with. So I think that they get in their way in the execution. Sometimes this is executed poorly, or for short-term gains, that kind of thing. But ultimately, there's a lot of sweet spot. There's a lot of revenue here, a lot of money on the table related to some of these tactics. There's also, pop-ups and stuff. If you're just running emails, there's tactic fatigue. The environment changes, and the natural selection mechanism related to the marketplace that we're in. It means that consumers they get savvy, and all wins are perishable, as we like to say. So we have to be mindful of that. Push notifications they were gold 5 years ago, and now they created some massive email lists a while ago, but it's kind of going extinct. I will say also on that, you mentioned personalization. I think that there's a lot of brands that get in their own way when they have sort of shiny object syndrome or shiny toy syndrome related to their tool stacks. There's a lot of products out there that are being sold that we still are lacking in computational traction to be able to actually fully execute them. Personalization, AI-based testing can be a couple examples. Those are areas where there's a couple examples where they're sold as solutions, but there's really still a lot of hard work and correctly, that they're not, that people don't realize a lot of that extra work that it entails. Gartner for last week put out a really cool study that predicted like 80% of personalization efforts are going to go away in the next 5 years, just because it's just not worth it for most brands. So you really have to have a strong foundation of data and how you're using data, your data strategy, in order to execute and kind of leverage these tools. And there's a lot of shiny toy syndrome basically happening out there that we're seeing. So poor execution of tactics, and trying to get silver bullets.
Yeah. So I mean, in that particular case, it's almost a lot of these solutions are inference-based personalization, or just kind of observing behavior, and that doesn't dovetail so well into having a stronger kind of individual user-based methodology, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, where we're seeing the personalization is one thing. Where we're seeing sort of something that's quite analogous but a little bit different, a bit of you could call it a tactic, but it's working really, really well now in the world. And like, it's being just a bit more conversational. If you think about a transaction in the direct-to-consumer world, you don't think of it as a complex sale, but when you think about brand marketing, it is quite complex. And so the more conversational we can be with that marketing, and the more, I want to use the word personalized, but not in the highly technical sense, but you can have sophisticated recommendation engines and really clever ways to communicate and to create a conversation and to add value, to leverage micro commitments and be focused on customer problems and not your own products. And that's where that conversational element, right, versus the
Mhm.
transactional element comes in. And Automate does a really good job at coming from that angle, as opposed to here's a tool that lets you do anything you want related to personalization. You just need to wrangle all of your data to be in perfect form for you to actually execute on it.
Thanks so much. I mean, I'll tell the team definitely. Automat loves to hear stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But one other thing I want to circle back on, kind of, is you brought up this idea of there's kind of this almost last mile. I mean, I'm putting those words in your mouth, but this product to checkout story that brands tell, and a lot of brands will try to increase order value or find ways to cross sell and just push up lifetime value overall within that moment. Are there any other things? I mean, we here at Automat focus a huge amount on that kind of stuff, and kind of generating confidence and belief as consumers get closer to purchase. Are there any other things that you see brands doing from a technical perspective or just from a UX perspective that really tells a strong story there?
Within that area, I mean, focusing on the unique sales proposition quite strongly. In that last mile is the way that you put it. I like that. The certainty of success, clarity of success is really critical here. How certain are you that this solution that you've found, whether it's skin cream or certain, whatever beauty product that it is, how certain are you that it's going to provide you with what you're looking for? And it's, in a lot of ways, that messaging is we see it as a really important and critical area to keep reminding or keep not prodding, but reinforcing as they're going through that last mile. And the ways to do that, I mean, customer service, clarity around that, clarity around what does this transaction mean? First time users is where you're playing around with that dial of conversion rate and cost of acquisition, right? So, what does it mean to transact with you? And I don't need it to be the best product. I just need to make sure that it's good and have clarity that it's good, right? And the more clear I am about that choice, the easier it is for me to make, and I'll go through that last mile, no problem.
Mm-hmm. So at the top level, I mean, we kind of established, I mean, that's a huge critical stage. And then if we look backwards on product discovery, what's some of the most efficient ways that you've seen beauty brands in particular kind of empower consumers to better discover products online? I mean, there's a lot of tools just in terms of different ways you can lay out your menu, everything from that to kind of faceted or kind of multifaceted search and filters, to just having a strong, like an actually effective kind of set of related products and kind of product packages or regimens or sets. Are there other, techniques or methodologies or particular ones within that you found generated a really strong response?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of really good ones, and that starts from the beginning with like search and filtering and navigation. I'll add in there a couple more of the classic examples is the comparison. Product comparison is done really, really well, very strongly on sites like Home Depot, right? But there's a lot of beauty retailers that don't quite do this all in a similar vein or as robustly, as I'll say. But that's another area that, in terms of product discovery, recommendation, clarity of success, clarity of this does talk to me, this does apply to what I need because it's got all these boxes checked here. That's another area. The related products that you mentioned, that's real classic. That idea too is that the classical, I use that word too much, but the normal way to do the personalization for returning users, if they might have come across a category page to come back to the site, and you're hitting them up with that messaging around related products that they've already kind of explored. So those are like the typical ways to mess with that. And then on top of that, it's going to be recommendation engines. There's simple ways, rule-based ways to drill down to a category level. And then there's some more advanced things that effectively drill down to that comparison tool level. They're using those meta fields within a comparison table to ask a bunch of questions related to what you might need, and then spitting out a couple, maybe one or two or three regimes, products that fit a comparison table kind of format. So that's and then there's things like the automated or chat solutions like Automat has. So they take that product recommendation and just kind of take a step forward with it, bring in a lot of data to be just more sophisticated, a little bit smarter about those interactions and how the data relate and how it relates over time. And so if we have this rule set, it equals this. If we have this rule set, it equals that outcome for this different segment of user. And so let's try to be real data focused here and tweak our recommendation system sort of automatically, right? And that's where I see where Automat comes in. And there's some other tools out there that are kind of that next level to a certain extent. But the basic principle is product recommendation. Yeah.
Okay, but bringing that the closer you bring that to the consumer, and the more kind of granular you make it, the better result you're going to get overall.
Yeah, that's been the trend over, I'd say, the last few years, of course, and you're leveraging things like you're allowing the customer to be problem focused, or you are problem focused. You're not product focused. So that by itself is kind of a differentiator. You allow them to go through these steps of head nods, right? They're this yes ladder. As they click through or as they engage with that chatbot, you're leveraging the consistency principle. If I engage with you, it increases the chance I'm going to engage again. You're also leveraging sunk cost fallacy. I've just talked to this chatbot for so long, and might as well, let's go through with this thing. That kind of thing. So there's a lot of psychological principles, behavioral principles at play there.
So obviously, when the method and the experience, I mean, to any of the features and kind of solutions we've talked about, when the execution is immaculate enough, let's say, I mean, it's going to tell a story either implicitly or explicitly to the user that carries them further along in the conversion process and sort of gets them over the hump. But a big aspect to a lot of retailers and beauty brands, and especially the big ones, is trust and kind of having trust and validation in their brand. And that sort of comes through with some of the UX benchmarking elements that you've brought up. Is there anything, is there one like killer mistake or move that a lot of brands do that they may not realize is compromising the trust that users have in their websites or their e-commerce sites?
A lot of times I see sites that this is a programmatic thing that I'm going to speak to. When we work in experimentation with experimentation programs, usually we're starting out on the marketing site, and we're pretty well pigeonholed, and that's where we live, and that's the only place we're allowed to sort of flex. But if you think about the full customer life cycle, it's not only there. I mean, before they've even hit the site, there's intent data relative to them wanting a particular product that exists out there that some brands are really hot on. And intent data is a huge new kind of term jargon that's really hot in the marketing world right now. And then they land on the site, they go through that transaction, and then they leave, and then they transact, and then what happens after? They just, so that's usually, when you ask that question, that's what came to mind first, is what happens after that sale, and how do you engage somebody? How do you from a very cut and dry kind of private.
You dropped out there for a second. Yeah.
From a very cut and dry private equity approach, e-commerce websites are, there's three pillars of growth. There's customers and then converting them. There's average order value, and then there's retention, frequency of purchase, how many times they come back. Experimentation can touch on all three of those, and the one that's generally relegated and there's big holes in it, it's just not sexy to address, is the retention part. I'm sorry, the retention part, the frequency of purchase, bringing them back, and so how well you treat them after they initially transact. That's I can go into details there, but that's generally where I see an issue.
When people go into their favorite store, if they go back and back, they'll recognize some of the staff. They'll notice a layout change. They'll notice something different, but they'll also get a certain level of recognition when they're a repeat customer. And I guess what you're saying is a lot of brands are dropping the ball in terms of that follow-up relationship, and that's one of the biggest kind of ways to compromise your revenue from an e-commerce perspective.
Exactly. And a lot of these brands, especially in the beauty and cosmetics world, lose money on that first transaction and only make money on the repeat ones. And so those are so critical. But from the marketing perspective, let's just get them through the door. We don't care. That's the sexy place to work. And we don't, after the fact, what happens and how do we treat them? Does the order get there on time? What's the clarity of that process? When is it going to show up? Is it going to melt or something like, there's just a lot of after the fact questions that don't have, some of them have a little bit to do with the website. You can answer some of that, but some of it you can't.
Okay. I guess, we've covered a whole lot about this report and just kind of dug into some real meat and potato stuff. On a broad level, I'd like to leave you with this final question, but, is there any kind of big change or big experience you see coming up, either in 2020 or just the next 5 years? What would you index on as one of the biggest trends in e-commerce, either for beauty brands or just brands in general that are looking to sell more and succeed and grow?
I'd say just the marketing teams are going to get a lot closer and closer to the customer, and from a few different angles. We talked about this conversational rather than the transactional approach. I think brand marketing and direct marketing are sort of combining. We see the same things happening between like B2B and B2C, and that sort of coming together to an extent as well. So just getting a lot closer to the customer, and that's going to reflect in marketing teams. For example, that same Gartner report that mentioned the personalization statistic also said that within 5 years, 25% of marketing teams are going to have an ethnographer or a behavioral psychologist on their team. That's a prediction that we're going to get closer and closer to the customer, and in terms of how to communicate effectively in a way that our brand is not hurt as we kind of roll out some of these different tactics like we like to do.
So really getting in the customer's perspective, in their shoes per se, but also having the shortest possible distance to actually act on that knowledge and that expertise.
Yeah, exactly. And you see some of this just in the news this week, like H&M, the story of H&M, the big, apparel retail company. 3 years ago, they were, their stock, or a few years ago, their stock price was just cut in half. They were doing really poor, literally burning clothes on the streets because they had so much inventory. What did they do? They hired a ton of data scientists to pour through customer intention data, customer behavioral data. They got better at predicting what trends are coming and how to interpret the customer data in terms of what they need. They are, this last year, they're up like 11% or something like that because they're better able to predict what their customers want and what they need, and they're doing a little bit better now.
So definitely some takeaways. Everybody needs to consider kind of getting outside of the box, the usual like digital marketer or kind of brand advertiser perspective to really integrate, the latest stuff that's coming, I think.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
So I won't take up more of your time. But before we go, is there anything in general you'd like to preview from CXL, or some of the research that you're doing right now that'll be coming out, or just, some links and resources that people can check out in the meantime?
Yeah, CXL.com is where you'll find us. I'll put a lot of emphasis on our institute. Our brand, our company is all about trying to educate and trying to get all this knowledge and raise the industry. I love working for the company because it has that mentality of transparency and living in a world of abundance and not scarcity. We don't guard all of our processes and methodologies. We publish it out there. In fact, most of our courses on the Institute are sort of outside of our agency. We find professionals all around the world practitioners that are teaching these courses. I am going to be a bit of an exception. I'm about to film a course on voice of customer methodologies related to experimentation programs. I'm also going to put out a course on here in the middle of next year on sort of the experimentation maturity model, and then in terms of what are different examples of the structures of organizations that execute experimentation programs successfully. So more from a strategic structural standpoint. So those are a couple previews, something that I'm working on right now that looking forward to getting out there.
Okay, great. So we'll put a few links to that stuff and where people can watch out for that in the description of this video. In the meantime, to everybody who's watching this and checking this out and digging into CXL and all the great stuff they have to offer, thanks for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time. And thanks to you, Ben, for all this great knowledge today.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I appreciate reaching out and being on here.
Awesome. Oh, take care.